Imagine walking toward your own execution.
Yeah.
You know the sheer, unmitigated agony waiting for you in just a few short hours. You know the betrayal that is about to happen.
It is a terrifying thought.
It really is. The physical torture and the total abandonment by your closest friends. What is on your lips in that moment?
Well, you would expect panic.
Right. Is it begging? I mean, is it a desperate attempt to bargain your way out of the inevitable?
Usually, yes. We expect screaming.
But when you step into the biblical narrative and look at Jesus Christ walking out into the night toward the Garden of Gethsemane and the cross, you see something staggering.
Absolutely.
He had a song on his lips. He was singing a hymn.
It is such a striking contrast.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is an intensive analysis where we take a massive stack of source material and we unpack it for you.
In this case, we are looking at Charles Spurgeon's legendary commentary, The Treasury of David.
Yes, alongside the brilliant theological minds he quotes. Our mission in this deep dive into the source material is to extract the absolute best theological meat from Psalm 116.
We want to help you grasp the believer's response to God's saving grace.
Spot on. And we are looking at this text strictly through the lens of Reformed theology, holding firmly to the Westminster Confession.
That means we are fixing our gaze on God's absolute sovereignty.
Yes, and the specific targeted nature of his grace, as well as the undeniable perseverance of his people.
So to truly understand the weight of that contrast we just mentioned, we have to establish the historical context of what we are reading today.
Right, the background of the song itself.
Precisely. This text, Psalm 116, is part of what is known historically as the Paschal Hallel.
These were the specific psalms sung by the Jewish people during the Passover feast.
Yeah, they were ancient songs of deliverance, explicitly designed to recall the exodus from Egypt.
To call to mind the shedding of the lamb's blood and the rescue of God's people from bondage.
But the context becomes infinitely heavier when we realize that Jesus Christ himself, as a devout Jew observing the law perfectly, sang this very hymn with his disciples in the upper room.
Wow.
He sang these precise words right before heading out into night toward the darkest hours of human history.
He was singing about death, about the sorrows of hell, and about divine rescue.
Yeah, while actively walking into the greatest suffering any human being would ever face.
He was singing about the Passover lamb while walking out to become the Passover lamb.
Absolutely. When you keep that historical reality in mind, the words of this text carry a theological mass that demands our complete attention.
That context changes the entire landscape for you when you read this text.
Yeah.
Because when we look at the opening of this psalm, the first two verses, it begins with a blunt, abrupt declaration.
Yes, I love the Lord.
It is so simple, yet so intensely concentrated.
Well, William Gouge, one of the Puritan commentators Spurgeon highlights in his work, brings out a fascinating point about the original Hebrew here.
The Puritans were obsessed with linguistic nuances, right?
Oh, yeah, they really were. And Gouge points out that this phrase is actually a single, abrupt word in the original language.
Just one word.
Yeah. He argues that when a person's heart is completely inflamed, when the soul is overwhelmed by a sudden apprehension of some extraordinary, massive favor from God, the affection actually causes an interruption in speech.
Makes stops.
Precisely. A neat, tidy, formal sentence simply cannot contain the pressure of the emotion.
So this concise, single-word burst shows an overflowing infection breaking through the syntax.
That is right. But then Spurgeon makes an observation that I find even more compelling. He argues that Christian affection is never a blind emotion.
It is not irrational.
No. Spurgeon states that this love sustains itself with rigid logic. We love God because he has heard our voice and our supplications.
Which is interesting because human love is so often portrayed as blind, illogical, or based on pure feeling, without any reasoned foundation.
Yeah, we see that all the time.
So why is it a good thing that the psalmist's love requires a reason? Think about a parent leaning over the crib of a sick child.
Okay, I am picturing it.
The child is so weak, fighting a massive fever, and they can barely whisper. They can only make a faint groaning sound.
Yeah, that is a heavy image.
But the parent bows down, inclines their ear, and strains to catch every single faint sound coming from that crib.
Right.
The child loves the parent because the parent responds to that fragile whisper. That is the logic of love Spurgeon is talking about here.
That analogy of the parent bending over the crib is precisely the mechanism the text gives us to understand God's condescension.
Because in the second verse, the text says, "Because he hath inclined his ear unto me."
Yes. And we have two commentators in our source material, Wolfgang Musculus and Sir Richard Baker, who provide incredible insight into the mechanics of this phrase.
How so?
Well, they contrast it with human hierarchies. Great men on earth, kings, magistrates, and politicians, do not typically listen to the poor and needy directly.
No, they use intermediaries.
Yeah, they use officers, servants, and massive bureaucratic systems to hear complaints. If you want a king's ear, you have to fight your way through a dozen layers of administration.
And even then, your plea is just summarized on a piece of paper.
Spot on. But the creator of the universe, the sovereign God who spoke billions of galaxies into existence and holds the atomic structure of the universe together by the word of his absolute authority, does not use bureaucrats to hear the cries of his people.
Wow. He bends down.
He inclines his own ear to the believer immediately and personally. The infinite God localizes his attention on the finite, broken sinner.
And because he bends down in such a personal, intimate way, the believer makes a highly logical resolution.
Yes, therefore will I call upon him as long as I live.
It is a reasoned, calculated response to an objective reality.
God listens, therefore I will speak to him until my dying breath. The logic is completely unbreakable.
But we have to ask where that intense, logical love is actually forged.
Right, the environment matters.
It is not born in a vacuum of comfort, sitting in a reclining chair. It is forged in the fires of extreme, terrifying distress.
Absolutely.
If you have ever felt the kind of absolute, inescapable panic where your own resources are completely exhausted, that is the exact space this text enters into next.
We see this clearly in the 3rd and 4th verses.
The psalmist describes his situation with language that should make us stop in our tracks. He says, "The sorrows of death compassed me, and the pains of hell get hold upon me. I found trouble and sorrow."
We really need to look closely at the mechanics of the Hebrew linguistics here, relying again on William Gouge.
What does he say about the word sorrows?
Well, it is highly metaphorical. In the ancient world, it related to the heavy, cruel cords used by creditors to bind debtors so they could not escape to another city.
So it is about being completely trapped.
Yes. It is also the same word used to describe the intense, inescapable physical pains of a woman in childbirth.
There is no backing out. The event is happening.
Precisely. And then another scholar, Joseph Carroll, notes that the phrase, "get hold upon me," or "found me," is very specific.
What kind of language is it?
It is the specialized language of an arresting officer finding a fugitive. The affliction arrests the believer. There is no escaping it, no running away, no bribing the officer.
And, this creates a massive theological friction.
How do you mean?
Well, if the believer is justified, if they are legally hidden in Christ and adopted by God, why do they still feel the pains of hell? Why do they feel that terror?
That is a very fair question.
I look at it like a person who has already been fully pardoned by a judge. The paperwork is signed, the seal is stamped, they're legally a free citizen.
Okay.
But they're still sitting in the dark, freezing jail cell, waiting for the guard to walk down the hall and open the iron door.
Yeah, the environment hasn't changed yet.
Exactly. Absolutely. While they wait, they suddenly experience the sheer panic of the environment.
The pardon is legally absolute, but the sensory experience of the cold prison walls is also very real to them in that moment.
Yes, that is the tension.
And that tension between the legal reality of our pardon and the experiential reality of our suffering is a core component of the Reformed understanding of the Christian life.
How do the commentators address that tension?
Well, William Hill Tucker provides a synthesis here that connects us right back to the upper room and the Passover context we started with.
Bringing it back to Christ.
Yes, he connects these pains of hell to Christ's experience in Gethsemane and on the cross.
Because Christ acted as the federal head and substitute for his people.
Right. And he actually experienced the literal pains of hell. He experienced the full, unmitigated wrath of God.
He took the literal bands of the grave.
He took the full arrest from the demands of the law, and he took the full sentence.
So because he absorbed the totality of that wrath, what happens to the justified believer?
When the believer feels the pains of hell surrounding them in this life, they are only ever experiencing the shadow of them, never the substance of eternal condemnation.
The substance was entirely absorbed by Christ.
Spot on. Charles Spurgeon often noted that a shadow of a dog cannot bite you, and the shadow of a sword cannot kill you.
Wow, that is a heavy, comforting truth.
So, when the believer is arrested by these terrifying shadows of affliction, the appropriate response is modeled brilliantly in the 4th verse.
It is not a long, eloquent theological dissertation, is it?
No, not at all. It is a short, breathless, desperate prayer. O Lord, I beseech thee, deliver my soul.
It is the cry of a person who has absolutely no resources left.
Appealing entirely to the sovereign mercy of the one who holds the keys to life and death.
And righteous. Yea, our God is merciful.
Now, on the surface, placing the words gracious and righteous right next to each other creates a severe theological problem.
It really does. How can a holy God be completely righteous, meaning he is perfectly just, demanding perfect, flawless payment for every single infraction of his law, and simultaneously be gracious to guilty, filthy sinners?
It sounds impossible.
If a human judge in a courtroom looks at a guilty murderer and says, "I am full of grace today, you are free to go," we do not call that a righteous judge.
No, we call that a corrupt, wicked judge who needs to be removed from the bench.
A righteous judge must punish crime. So how does God do both?
Spurgeon answers this apparent contradiction with an image that is just staggering. He says, "The sword of justice is scabbarded in a jeweled sheath of grace."
Scabbarded in a jeweled sheath.
Yes. Justice is not ignored, swept under the rug, or relaxed. It is fully satisfied, and then it is sheathed within the grace provided.
And then the 6th verse introduces who receives this specific grace.
Yeah.
The Lord preserveth the simple.
What does simple mean here in this context?
Well, it does not mean someone who lacks intelligence.
Right.
It means those who are stripped of worldly craft, manipulation, or guile. It means those who have zero backup plans.
William Gouge explains the metaphor for the phrase brought low in this text, which relates perfectly to that idea.
What is the metaphor?
It comes from the Hebrew concept of a pond or a brook that is completely, entirely dried up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when the severe drought comes, the water vanishes, the mud turns to dust, and there is nothing left but dry, cracked earth.
That is the simple person. Their own internal resources are bone dry.
Precisely. They cannot scheme, buy, or talk their way out of their affliction. They bring nothing to the table.
The Westminster Confession of Faith provides the precise, structural theological architecture to understand this, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows how God can be both entirely gracious and entirely righteous to that dried-up, simple believer.
And it is found in the mechanics of the doctrine of justification.
Yes. We have to assume a basic understanding of justification here, but we really need to look at the mechanics of imputation to see how the sword is sheathed.
God does not justify sinners by lowering his standard or relaxing his law.
No, he justifies them through a double imputation. He imputes the believer's sin to Christ, and he imputes Christ's perfect, flawless righteousness to the believer.
But we must remember that Christ's work was twofold: his passive obedience and his active obedience.
Right. His passive obedience means he willingly absorbed the penalty of the broken law on the cross, taking the wrath we deserved.
He cleared the ledger of our debt.
But clearing a ledger only gets you to zero. It does not make you righteous.
That is where Christ's active obedience comes in.
Precisely. For 33 years, he lived a life of flawless, perfect submission to the law of God. He earned a treasury of merit. Because the penalty was fully paid in blood on the cross, and simultaneously the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus.
The sword of justice finds its terrifying mark in the substitute,
which allows the jeweled sheath of grace to cover the believer.
So when your personal brook is entirely dry, when you have exhausted all human effort and realize you contribute absolutely nothing to your salvation except the sin that made it necessary, God provides a rescue.
A rescue based entirely on the merits of another.
And when you realize you are holding a completely empty cup and God has filled it based on the merits of Christ, the response of your soul is documented in the 7th through 9th verses.
Let's read that. The text says, "Return unto thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee."
The psalmist points out that God has provided a triune deliverance here.
Yes, he delivered the soul from death, the eyes from tears, and the feet from falling.
This is a complete, holistic rescue of the entire person. So the logical command the psalmist gives to himself is to return to rest.
But right after saying rest, the 9th verse presents what looks like a glaring contradiction.
It really does. It says, "I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living."
How can you be at rest and walking at the exact same time? Motion and rest seem to be total opposites.
I compare this to riding a bicycle.
Okay, walk us through that.
Well, if you stop moving forward on a bicycle, you lose your balance and you crash into the pavement.
Yeah, you fall over.
You only find your balance. your stability, your actual rest on the bike when you are actively pedaling and moving forward.
That's a brilliant way to picture it.
The walking and the resting are not enemies. They require each other to function.
The soul rests completely in the finished objective work of justification, and out of that secure, immovable rest, the believer walks forward in active obedience.
Nathaniel Hardy, another brilliant commentator from the source material, clarifies this beautiful paradox perfectly.
What does he say?
He points out that spiritual rest makes no man idle, and spiritual walking makes no man weary.
They are completely subservient to each other.
Yeah. Confidence in God's finished work is the very means to quicken our obedience, and our active obedience strengthens our internal confidence.
So when the psalmist says he will walk before the Lord in the land of the living, he is making a conscious resolution.
A resolution to live his life under the constant, careful, scrutinizing eye of a loving Father.
Which contrasts sharply with living to seek the approval of the surrounding culture.
Right. Walking in the land of the living means acknowledging that your life is preserved by God.
And therefore, your daily actions, your mundane decisions, and your literal steps are ordered by him and performed for an audience of one.
The rest is internal, secured entirely by the grace of justification.
And the walk is external. The visible, active fruit of sanctification flowing from that internal security.
But let us be honest, that walk is not always a perfectly straight line.
No, it is not.
Which is what makes the 10th and 11th verses so incredibly relatable for anyone trying to live this out.
The psalmist admits his own severe human frailty here.
He does. He says, I believed, therefore have I spoken. I was greatly afflicted. I said in my haste, all men are liars.
There is a massive tension here between faithful speech and panicked speech.
Contrap notes that believers have their offs and ons.
They go through radically different frames of heart and tempers of soul.
The psalmist spoke from a place of deep, grounded faith when he prayed to God for deliverance.
Yeah, but he spoke from a place of sheer, unadulterated panic when he judged human nature in the middle of his affliction.
It forces us to ask a hard question. Was David actively sinning when he called all men liars? Was this just a total failure of his faith?
How do you look at it?
Well, I look at it this way. While the words were spoken in severe haste and perhaps lacked charity towards specific individuals in the moment, they actually erred on the right side of the theological ledger.
So,
They erred by just trusting the creature and falling back entirely on the Creator.
that is a fascinating point.
In a moment of absolute crushing crisis, realizing that human beings cannot save you is actually a theological necessity, even if the phrasing is born out of intense distress.
That is a crucial distinction to make. We really have to look at how God uses affliction mechanically in the life of a believer.
How does he use it?
Affliction is designed by a sovereign God to act as a solvent.
Assault.
Yeah. It is designed to aggressively strip away our reliance on human institutions, on influential friends, on political leaders, and on our own carefully constructed networks.
Because when the real pressure hits, when the medical diagnosis comes or the financial ruin drops, human support structures almost always crumble.
They do. They crumble either because people lack the moral will to help, or because they simply lack the sovereign capacity to save us from real despair.
So the hasty declaration that all men are liars is the painful, bruising realization that absolute truth, absolute reliability, and absolute salvation are not found in mankind.
They are found only in God. The affliction dissolves our misplaced idolatrous trust in the horizontal world, and it violently forces our gaze vertically.
Even in the middle of his panic, the psalmist is being driven by the Holy Spirit to the correct theological conclusion.
God alone is true. God alone is the deliverer.
Every human being who promises ultimate security is, by definition, lying, because they do not possess the capacity to guarantee it.
And when you reach that stark conclusion, when you realize God has delivered you from the brink and that all human help was utterly useless, you run headfirst into the problem presented in the 12th through 16th verses.
Yes, the psalmist asks a question that seems impossible to answer. What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits toward me?
This is the economics of grace, and it is a fascinating problem to try and solve.
How do you repay an infinite debt?
Right. If someone saves your life, your natural human instinct is to want to pay them back.
You want to square the ledger.
But what if the person who saved you owns the entire universe and requires absolutely nothing from you?
Sir Richard Baker notes something brilliant here about the mechanics of gratitude.
What does he say?
He says that rendering anything to God simply means taking more from him.
You cannot add to God's wealth.
No. I compare this to being a starving beggar invited to a massive, opulent banquet by a phenomenally wealthy king.
Okay, set the scene for us.
You arrive with holes in your shoes, dirt in your face, and absolutely no money in your pockets. The king feeds you the finest meal of your life.
So, how do you honor the host of the feast?
Well, you do not honor him by walking into the royal kitchen, rolling up your sleeves, and offering to wash the dishes to pay for the meal.
No, that would be a massive insult to his staggering wealth and his boundless hospitality.
The only way to truly honor the host is to eat the food, ask for a second helping, and praise the incredible quality of the meal to anyone who will listen.
You render thanks by taking the cup of salvation and drinking intensely.
Yes.
And the imagery of the cup of salvation ties directly into the mechanics of Old Testament drink offerings.
In the Levitical sacrificial system, right?
Yeah. After a major deliverance or a vow was completed, a worshiper would pour out a drink offering as a tangible, visible sign of gratitude to God.
But we have to look at how Christ fulfills this specific imagery to understand the Reformed view of grace.
Because total depravity dictates that we have absolutely nothing of value to offer God.
We are spiritually bankrupt. So how do we get a cup of salvation to drink from in the first place?
Jesus drank the cup of God's wrath in Gethsemane and on the cross.
He took the cup of judgment, filled to the brim with divine justice against our sin, and he drained it completely dry.
He drank the dregs.
Because he emptied the cup of wrath, he could then refill it with his own righteous merits, turning it into the cup of salvation for his people.
So when the justified believer takes that cup, they are simply receiving the benefits of his finished, objective work.
Furthermore, the response of the believer in the 16th verse is striking.
What is their response?
O Lord, truly I am thy servant and the son of thine handmaid. Thou hast loosed my bonds.
This is the great paradox of grace in action.
Being freed from the terrifying bonds of sin, death, and hell does not lead to modern Western autonomy.
No, it does not mean you get to do whatever you want with your life.
It makes us willing, joyful bondslaves to Christ.
The freedom he purchased for us with his own blood binds us entirely to his service.
We dedicate our lives to laboring for God, obeying his commands, taking up his yoke, and acknowledging that we are absolutely his property.
Bought with an infinite price.
Which brings us to what is easily the most shocking, counterintuitive verse in the entire Psalm, the 15th verse.
Let's read it.
Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints.
Now that is a massive statement.
We spend our entire lives fighting death, tooth and nail. Doctors dedicate decades to fighting it. We diet and exercise obsessively to avoid it.
We spend billions of dollars researching how to delay it.
And we grieve intensely when it finally arrives at our door. Death is the ultimate enemy.
Yet the text says, God views the physical death of his people as precious, honorable, and highly valued.
If God is the author of life, why would he find the death of his people precious?
It is a difficult concept to grasp.
If he loves them with an infinite love, why not just keep them alive forever on earth, completely shielded from the physical pain of dying?
It seems so violently opposed to everything we feel in our bones about losing someone we love.
It is entirely opposed to the natural fallen human mind.
Which is why Sir Richard Baker's analogy on this specific verse is so vital to grasp.
What is his analogy?
He suggests that God has a heavenly cabinet, and he decorates this cabinet with the deaths of his saints.
We really have to understand the mechanics of how a sovereign God repurposes the consequences of the fall.
Right. Death entered the world as a penal judgment for sin. It was a curse.
But for the justified believer, death is no longer a penal judgment. It is a defeated, defanged enemy.
Christ completely removed the sting of death through his resurrection.
Therefore, God now takes this defeated enemy and uses it as a mere vehicle, a chariot, to transition his people from a world of sorrow, sin, and decay into a state of eternal, sinless glorification.
God is completely, meticulously sovereign over the final breath of every single believer.
He orchestrates the exact timing, the exact location, and the exact method.
Whether it is a quiet, peaceful passing in a warm bed surrounded by a weeping family, or a brutal, violent martyr's end at the stake, God is in absolute control of it.
Look at the historical account of John Philpot, one of the English reformers who was burned at the stake in Smithfield during the Marian persecutions.
That is a staggering story.
As he was being led out to his execution, walking through the foul mud of the execution grounds, he kneeled down on the earth.
And what did he say?
He said, "I will pay my vows in thee, O Smithfield."
He viewed his impending, violent, agonizing death as a precious offering to God.
because he knew his sovereign God viewed it as a precious, calculated victory.
God takes what the watching world views as the ultimate final defeat and turns it into the crowning jewel of the believer's redemption.
I want to bring all these massive theological concepts right back down to the ground for you.
Let's summarize it.
Think about the progression we have tracked today. You have a sovereign God who leans down from the absolute heights of the courts of heaven, bypassing all intermediaries, to hear your faintest, most desperate whispers.
He rescues you when the brook of your own personal resources is completely dried up to dust and the terrifying shadows of hell are arresting you.
He gives you a secure, objective rest that actually empowers you to walk forward in obedience.
And he graciously accepts your total dependence as the only acceptable repayment for his infinite benefits.
And then at the very end of it all, he carefully, meticulously orchestrates your final breath.
Viewing your physical departure from this world not as a tragic loss, but as a precious, highly valued jewel in his cabinet.
So how should you live today in light of that staggering reality?
If your ultimate rest is permanently secured by Christ's finished work of active and passive obedience, and if even your physical death is deemed a precious, orchestrated victory by God,
Then the entire concept of earthly failure is completely dismantled.
it falls apart on contact with this text.
The worst possible thing that can happen to you in this life, losing your life, is simply the vehicle God uses to bring you into his immediate glorified presence.
That completely changes how you face tomorrow morning.
It changes how you face medical news and how you face financial ruin.
Yeah.
We want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.
It has been an absolute joy to walk through these heavy, brilliant truths with you.
Goodbye for now.
Goodbye, and thank you for listening.